Welcome to this segment of Business Today. I'm Karo Ashaba. Now today we give a brief insight about trade policies in Uganda, and to discuss this will be Mr. Ogwal from the Private Sector Foundation. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon to you.
Please briefly introduce yourself.
My name is Moses Ogwal. I'm Director of Policy and Advocacy in Private Sector Foundation, Uganda.
Would you please give us your brief analysis about the recently read budget?
The recently read budget, we concluded that was consistent to aspirations of the private sector. That is the general conclusion we have. We concluded like that because it addressed some of the key issues which the private sector had presented to government, the issues which relate to predictability of the economy, issues which relate to reducing the cost of doing business so that the private sector can be competitive, and lastly, the issue which will ensure that implementation of what is agreed takes place. So when you look at the budget discussions, allocation of resources, and the speech itself, it tends to address those issues. Issues like predictability of policy, particularly ensuring that the macroeconomic framework is managed properly. We got the assurance, hopefully, to be done. Elements of inflation, interest rates. We recall 2011, and our worry is that 2015, 2016 should not be replicated. And we got that assurance that all will be done to ensure that everything goes on well. On the front of reducing the cost of doing business, we saw a lot of investments in maybe the issue of predictability of the environment. We could also include security of our property, security of the environment. We also saw the kind of allocation of resources and assurance again that security will be a key thing. Is very key for the private sector. Then on the issue of reduction of cost of doing business, we saw proper allocation and continuous prioritization of electricity. The cost of electricity is still high, but we think the direction to it is to allocate more resources to it so that we eventually get electricity which can enable us to be more competitive. Transport, I think investment related to the railway. We were very particularly impressed with a lot of investment on bridges, because we've been seeing that has been a big gap. Good trunk roads developed, but they are not bridged with the rural area, which have a deficiency or challenge of bridges, especially the non-all-weather roads, so that you can get the real results you want from a road, which is a reduction in cost of production. So I think most of the members were happy with that. Also, investment in, of course, some other infrastructure which has been mentioned was key generally in reduction of cost of doing business. We're also happy with the regulatory framework, especially the licensing regime. An act has been passed and assented to, I think, by the presidency to enable the issue of removal of licenses which are obsolete and ensuring those regulations or laws which are supposed to support businesses in terms of creating a more level play field is generated, while those which increase the costs of production and they are not necessary are guillotined out of the process of the licensing. So I think, also happy with that. And lastly, in that sequence is promise that they will put a lot of emphasis in ensuring that implementation is done, pronouncing the Prime Minister's office to be able to follow up and ensure that service delivery is done. I think the intention and spirit of the budget was consistent with the thinking of the private sector.
Okay. So as private sector, you're saying you're contented with this year's budget in comparison to last year's, right?
No, let me not talk of last year's, because last year's we had a lot of challenges with the tax regime and so on.
But this
And
is much better.
let me restrict my comment to this one. In the circumstances, it responds to the expectations in the short and long-term period of time to what the expectation of the business community is for creating a more competitive private sector.
That's well said. So as private sector, you've been signing so many agreements like the East African Community. How is that going to affect trade here in Uganda?
The private sector does not sign agreements. It is government which signs those agreements, and they have signed, of course, East African Community, and then also recently in June they signed the tripartite agreement, which brings a bigger part of Africa together. We've signed also the EPA. I think all those agreements do one thing. They try to create an understanding of how we will have a trading regime with most of these countries. I think we're in the era of opening up. Whether you have these agreements or not, the World Trade Regime dictates that you must open up. But how best do you open up is what could be defined in these agreements. And we are seeing, especially East African Community, we are seeing a lot of improvement in our trade regime. We are seeing skills flow and investment flow within our countries. We are seeing a lot of trade working together, and we are expecting a lot again, especially as we look at the Northern Corridor. How is the private sector going to participate in supporting the development projects of the Northern Corridor? Those are all aspects which we think are positive generally. But having said that they are positive, when you have an agreement, it gives the point that the competition is open. And what is key in most of these agreements is that protections like external tariffs are removed, non-tariff barriers are removed.
Doesn't that affect trade?
No, the spirit is fine. It now requires what we should do as Uganda to enable us succeed in these agreements. It actually requires us to be competitive. And it goes back to what I've said. We should not expect these agreements to make us competitive. It is Uganda which should see that it is competitive. And it must act on the issues which I mentioned at the beginning. One, we must invest in reduction of cost of doing business. Infrastructure, we must have human productivity through skilling Uganda, through health services. We must have a very stable macroeconomic regime to spur these areas. Issues of inflation, issues of interest rates must be robust in such a way that it will spur this growth expected. And we must do what we say we are going to do. That is key. So those are the things we must do to make us competitive, which will make us take advantage of all the agreements signed. But we must also agree that we cannot achieve them all at a go. So it must be spaced. That's why the issue of time and the investment should be interlinked. So if we have opened up that we're going to be, we will be trading at equal ground with South Africa in 3 years. Are we going to have our electricity down in 3 years? That comes back to Uganda government to see that you have to invest to ensure that in 3 years, when you open up to trade with countries like South Africa, you are able to compete. And those are the underlying factors.
And as private sector now, have you done enough sensitization on investment?
Investments, you don't need to even sensitize. You need to create the environment to enable the investments to take place. Then they will come. Investments are like water. They flow where it is, there's a slope. It cannot flow where there's a hill. So if there's a hill, don't expect investments. You need to create slopes. The worst should be a flat ground. So it goes back to those issues of competitiveness, which I mentioned, or the environment to allow investment thrive, which I think by and large is being done, but should be done in a more smarter way. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
With all these views from Mr. Moses Ogwal, we hope to have better trade policies in Uganda as we see the development goals taking root. I'm Kara Ashaba. Keep it Business Today.